In the rolling hills of Virginia horse country, hidden behind stone walls and private gates, stand some of America's most beautiful estates. These mansions, with their colonial architecture and manicured grounds, represent the pinnacle of old money respectability. But many of them were built with what might be the most toxic money in American history. Fortunes made by knowingly selling products that killed millions of people. These are the estates of tobacco executives, the men who ran Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, and other cigarette companies. The men who knew for decades that cigarettes caused cancer, that nicotine was addictive, that their products killed people, and who responded by lying, by marketing to children, by manipulating nicotine levels to increase addiction, and by building beautiful mansions in Virginia while their customers died of lung cancer. This is the story of the Marlboro fortune, the most successful cigarette brand in history, marketed by the Marlboro man as rugged and masculine while actually delivering cancer, emphysema, and death. It's the story of internal documents that prove tobacco executives knew exactly what they were selling. And it's the story of estates built on blood money, where executives lived in luxury while millions of their customers suffocated to death. If this story made you pause or rethink something, help it reach someone else who should hear it too. A like, a subscription, or a thoughtful comment helps this video travel further and keeps these stories alive. The Philip Morris Company was founded in London in 1847, originally as a tobacconist shop. The American branch was established in 1902 in New York, initially a small player in an industry dominated by the American Tobacco Company Trust. But after that trust was broken up by antitrust action in 1911, Philip Morris had room to grow. For decades, Philip Morris was a second-tier cigarette company, known mainly for brands like Benson & Hedges. The company's fortune changed in the 1950s with the launch and rebranding of Marlboro cigarettes. Originally marketed to women with the slogan, "Mild as May," Marlboro was a failing brand until Leo Burnett Advertising came up with a revolutionary idea: reposition it as the ultimate masculine cigarette. The Marlboro Man campaign, launched in 1955, was arguably the most successful advertising campaign in history. Rugged cowboys, the American West, freedom, independence, all associated with a filtered cigarette that was actually killing people by the millions. Sales exploded. Within a decade, Marlboro went from a minor brand to the best-selling cigarette in America. But 1955 was also the year that scientific evidence about smoking and lung cancer became undeniable. Studies were showing that smokers were dying of lung cancer at much higher rates than non-smokers. The tobacco industry faced a crisis. They had a product that was addictive and extremely profitable, but also deadly. Their response would define corporate evil for the next half-century. In December 1953, the CEOs of America's largest tobacco companies met secretly at the Plaza Hotel in New York. They had just received devastating news. Scientific studies were proving beyond doubt that smoking caused cancer. They faced a choice: acknowledge the truth and see their industry collapse, or fight back with lies and manipulation. They chose lies. The result was the frank statement to cigarette smokers, published in newspapers nationwide in January 1954. In it, the tobacco companies claimed that the link between smoking and cancer was not proven, that they cared deeply about public health, and that they would support research into the question. It was all lies. Internal documents later revealed that tobacco executives already knew cigarettes caused cancer. The research they funded was designed not to find truth, but to create doubt. The goal wasn't to prove cigarettes were safe. It was to make the public uncertain about whether they were dangerous. This strategy of manufactured doubt would be the tobacco industry's playbook for the next 40 years. When studies showed smoking caused cancer, the industry funded studies to question those findings. When evidence emerged that nicotine was addictive, the industry claimed it wasn't. When secondhand smoke was proven dangerous, the industry disputed it. And all the while, they continued selling cigarettes, hooking new customers, and getting richer as their customers got sicker. Philip Morris executives were at the forefront of this deception. Internal company documents, eventually released through litigation, show that they knew cigarettes killed people, that they understood nicotine was addictive, and that they deliberately manipulated their products to increase addiction. One particularly damning document from a Philip Morris scientist in 1972 stated, The cigarette should be conceived not as a product but as a package. The product is nicotine. Think of the cigarette as a dispenser for a dose unit of nicotine. They knew. They always knew. And they sold cigarettes anyway, making billions while their customers died. As Philip Morris grew into the world's largest tobacco company, its executives became extraordinarily wealthy, and many of them chose to build estates in Virginia, the heart of tobacco country. Virginia had grown tobacco since colonial times. It was a crop that made the colony profitable, the foundation of Virginia's early economy. For tobacco executives, Virginia represented legitimacy. Building estates there connected them to American history, to the landed gentry tradition, to something more respectable than selling addictive poison. Their mansions in Albemarle County and Louisa County, near Charlottesville, were designed to look like they'd been there for generations, like old money rather than blood money. These estates were spectacular, 10,000 square feet or more, on hundreds of acres, with horse farms, private lakes, and architecture that mimicked Virginia's colonial plantations. They had formal gardens, staff quarters, and every luxury imaginable. They were designed to project wealth, taste, and respectability. But they were built with money from selling cancer. Every brick, every marble floor, every chandelier was paid for by people who had died gasping for breath, their lungs destroyed by tobacco. The estates represented the ultimate disconnect. Executives living in pastoral luxury, while their products created mass suffering. One particularly notable estate belonged to George Weissman, who served as CEO of Philip Morris from 1978 to 1984. His Virginia horse farm was the kind of place featured in architectural magazines. Beautiful, tasteful, understated in the way only the truly wealthy can afford. Weissman raised thoroughbreds, entertained other executives, and lived the life of a Virginia gentleman. He also oversaw the expansion of Marlboro into international markets, hooking millions of new smokers in developing countries where health regulations were weak or non-existent. The horses he raised on his estate were paid for by teenagers in Indonesia getting addicted to cigarettes. If this story made you pause or rethink something, help it reach someone else who should hear it too. A like, a subscription, or a thoughtful comment helps this video travel further and keeps these stories alive. The tobacco industry's relationship with Virginia went beyond just executives building estates. The entire state economy was entangled with tobacco money. Philip Morris's manufacturing center was in Richmond. The company was one of Virginia's largest employers and taxpayers. Politicians from both parties depended on tobacco money for campaign contributions. This created a corrupt system where Virginia's political establishment protected the tobacco industry, even as evidence mounted that cigarettes were killing people. When the U.S. Surgeon General issued reports on smoking and health, Virginia politicians denounced them as federal overreach. When other states sued tobacco companies to recover health care costs, Virginia's Attorney General refused to join. The tobacco companies used their Virginia presence as a shield. They presented themselves as pillars of the Virginia economy, employers of thousands, supporters of communities. They donated to hospitals, while creating patients for those hospitals. They funded universities, while killing educated people who should have lived decades longer. They sponsored youth programs, while marketing to children. And Virginia politicians took the money and protected the industry. It was regulatory capture on a massive scale, with an entire state government essentially working for companies that were killing its own citizens. The Virginia estates of tobacco executives were symbols of this corrupt relationship. These weren't just private homes. They were statements of power. They said, "We're so wealthy and connected that we can live in luxury in the state capital while selling death, and nobody can touch us." For decades, that was true. But the tobacco industry's wall of deception began to crack in the 1990s. Whistleblowers came forward. Internal documents were leaked. State attorneys general began filing lawsuits to recover the healthcare costs of treating smoking-related diseases. The most damaging evidence came from the industry's own files. Documents showed that tobacco executives had lied for decades about what they knew. They had known since the 1950s that smoking caused cancer. They had known since the 1960s that nicotine was addictive. They had known that their marketing targeted children. They had known everything, and they had lied about all of it. One particularly damning set of documents came from Brown and Williamson, later acquired by R.J. Reynolds, but they revealed industry-wide practices that Philip Morris and other companies had engaged in as well, deliberately manipulating nicotine levels to increase addiction, marketing to teenagers because that's when most smokers start, targeting minority communities with specific brands and advertising, funding research designed to create doubt rather than find truth, lying to Congress under oath about whether they knew nicotine was addictive. In 1994, the heads of the 7 largest tobacco companies testified before Congress. Each was asked directly, "Do you believe nicotine is addictive?" Each said no. They were lying, and internal documents later proved they had been lying. They committed perjury in front of Congress rather than admit what they had known for decades. The rage this generated was enormous. The public realized they had been systematically deceived by an industry that had knowingly sold them products that killed 400,000 Americans every year. Politicians who had been protecting the tobacco industry suddenly found it politically untenable to continue doing so. The result was the 1998 Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement, in which Philip Morris and other major tobacco companies agreed to pay $246 billion to states over 25 years to compensate for smoking-related healthcare costs. It was the largest civil settlement in U.S. history. But here's the thing, $246 billion sounds like a lot, but tobacco companies made more than that in profits during the years they were lying. Philip Morris alone was generating over $10 billion in annual profits at its peak. The settlement was a slap on the wrist, a cost of doing business, not real accountability. And the settlement explicitly protected the tobacco companies from future liability. States agreed not to pursue further lawsuits. The companies admitted no wrongdoing. They paid money, a lot of money, but they didn't face criminal charges. No executives went to prison for lying to Congress. No one was held personally accountable for decisions that killed millions of people. The Virginia estates of tobacco executives remained intact. The mansions built with blood money stayed in private hands. The wealth accumulated from decades of lying and killing was protected by settlement agreements and corporate structures. The tobacco executives who had overseen the lying campaigns, who had manipulated nicotine levels, who had marketed to children, they retired to their Virginia estates and lived out their lives in luxury. Some donated to charity, trying to buy respectability. Some gave to medical research, presumably without irony. None faced any real consequences for what they had done. George Weissman, the Philip Morris CEO who had expanded Marlboro internationally, died in 2009 at age 90. His obituaries praised his business acumen and philanthropic work. They mentioned he had worked for a tobacco company, but treated it as a neutral fact rather than a moral condemnation. He died wealthy, comfortable, and essentially unpunished for helping hook millions of people on cigarettes that killed them. If this story made you pause or rethink something, help it reach someone else who should hear it too. A like, a subscription, or a thoughtful comment helps this video travel further and keeps these stories alive. The human cost of the tobacco industry's deception is almost incomprehensible. Smoking has killed over 20 million Americans since the first Surgeon General's report in 1964. That's more than all American military deaths in all wars combined. It's more than AIDS, car accidents, and murders combined. It's a holocaust carried out slowly, one cigarette at a time, over decades. And it was preventable. If tobacco companies had been honest about the dangers of smoking, millions of lives could have been saved. If they had marketed responsibly instead of targeting children, generations of addiction could have been prevented. If they had accepted regulation instead of fighting it, public health measures could have been implemented decades earlier. But honesty would have hurt profits. Responsible marketing would have reduced sales. Accepting regulation would have constrained the industry. So they lied, they manipulated, they fought every public health measure, and millions of people died as a result. The executives who made these decisions didn't see the consequences up close. They lived in Virginia estates, far from the hospital wards where their customers died of lung cancer. They didn't watch as people suffocated from emphysema, gasping for breath through oxygen masks. They didn't see families destroyed when a smoker died at 50, leaving behind young children. They didn't attend the funerals. They just collected the profits and built bigger mansions. Philip Morris's strategy wasn't just to sell cigarettes in America. It was to expand globally, particularly into developing countries where health regulations were weak and populations were vulnerable to marketing. The company targeted Asia, Africa, and Latin America with aggressive marketing campaigns. In countries where literacy rates were low, they used visual marketing. The Marlboro Man didn't need translation. In countries where governments were corrupt or weak, Philip Morris lobbied against health regulations and warning labels. The result was a global epidemic of smoking-related disease, particularly in poor countries that lacked the healthcare infrastructure to deal with it. China alone has over 300 million smokers and faces a coming wave of lung cancer deaths. India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, all have been targeted by tobacco marketing and all face massive public health crises as a result. And Philip Morris executives knew exactly what they were doing. Internal documents show they specifically targeted developing countries because they represented growth markets as smoking declined in developed nations. They knew that selling cigarettes in poor countries would kill people, but those people were far away and didn't matter compared to profits. The Virginia estates of tobacco executives were built not just on American deaths, but on a global body count that continues to grow. Every day, tobacco kills over 8 million people worldwide. The majority are now in developing countries, addicted to products marketed to them by companies like Philip Morris. In 2008, Philip Morris Companies renamed itself Altria Group, separating the tobacco business from other assets and trying to distance itself from the Philip Morris name that had become synonymous with corporate evil. It was a rebranding exercise, an attempt to escape the legacy of lying and killing. But changing names doesn't change history. Altria still makes and sells cigarettes. It's still profiting from addiction and death. And the executives who ran Philip Morris during its decades of deception faced no real accountability. Their estates remain some of the most beautiful properties in Virginia. Some have been sold. Tobacco executives die like everyone else, though often from the very product they sold. And the estates pass to new owners who may not even know their history. The mansions are just expensive houses now, their origins forgotten or deliberately obscured. This historical amnesia is itself a kind of crime. These estates should be marked with plaques explaining what they represent. Monuments to corporate evil, built with money from knowingly selling addictive poison, testaments to how the wealthy can commit mass murder and face no real consequences. But wealthy people don't put plaques on their estates explaining that the previous owner killed people for profit. So the estates remain beautiful and unmarked, their history buried along with the millions who died from tobacco. The tobacco industry's playbook: create doubt, fund sympathetic research, fight regulation, and deny responsibility, has been adopted by other industries facing inconvenient scientific evidence. The fossil fuel industry used tobacco's tactics to create doubt about climate change. The sugar industry used them to deflect blame for obesity and diabetes. The chemical industry used them to avoid regulation of toxic substances. Philip Morris and other tobacco companies didn't just kill millions with their products. They created a template for how corporations can knowingly harm people and avoid accountability. The manufactured doubt strategy they pioneered is now standard practice for industries facing scientific evidence that their products cause harm. This is perhaps the tobacco industry's most lasting legacy. They prove that with enough money, enough lawyers, and enough willingness to lie, you can sell deadly products for decades while avoiding real consequences. The Virginia estates are just the visible symbols of this larger truth. Today, Philip Morris International, the overseas business spun off from Altria, is pivoting to reduced harm products like IQOS, a heat-not-burn tobacco device. The company is trying to rebrand itself as a public health ally, claiming it wants to create a smoke-free future. This would be admirable if it weren't coming from a company that spent 70 years lying about the harms of smoking, fighting every attempt at regulation, and marketing to children. Philip Morris's sudden concern for public health is about as credible as an arsonist starting a fire department. The company is still selling over 700 billion cigarettes annually worldwide. It's still making billions in profits from addiction and death. The smoke-free future. Marketing is just the latest rebranding exercise, another attempt to escape accountability for decades of knowingly killing people. And some descendants of tobacco executives are using inherited wealth for philanthropy, try to buy redemption for fortunes built on suffering. But no amount of charitable giving can resurrect the dead. No philanthropic foundation can undo decades of lying. The blood money remains blood money, no matter how it's spent. The Virginia estates themselves tell a story about American capitalism and its capacity for moral bankruptcy. These properties represent the gap between how wealth appears and how it's actually made. They look like symbols of success, taste, and respectability. They're actually monuments to mass death. Walking through one of these estates, through the formal gardens, past the stables, into the grand entrance hall, you're surrounded by beauty built on suffering. Every element of luxury was purchased with money from people who died horrible deaths, drowning in their own fluids as their lungs failed, or withering away from cancer, or suffocating from emphysema. The executives who lived in these estates knew what they were doing. They saw the research. They read the internal memos. They attended the meetings where strategies were discussed for creating doubt about smoking and health. They made conscious decisions to prioritize profits over human life. And then they went home to their beautiful estates and lived comfortable lives, far from the consequences of their decisions. There's a particular cruelty in the geography of it all. Virginia, where these estates sit, is also home to some of America's poorest communities. Rural Virginia has high smoking rates and high rates of smoking-related disease. The same state where tobacco executives built luxury estates also has communities devastated by the product those executives sold. Drive through Southside Virginia, and you'll see tobacco barns alongside mobile homes, Dollar Generals next to closed factories, communities that never recovered from the decline of tobacco farming. These are the people who grew tobacco for companies like Philip Morris, who worked in cigarette factories, who smoked the products and died young. And just a few hours north, in horse country, are the estates, beautiful, valuable, completely insulated from the poverty and disease that tobacco created. The executives who made billions selling cigarettes never had to confront the human cost. They lived in a bubble of wealth and privilege, surrounded by people who would never challenge them. This is how inequality works in America. The people who profit from harmful products live in beautiful isolation, while the people harmed live in communities they'll never visit. Some of the tobacco estates have been converted to other uses. A few have become event venues. You can rent them for weddings, corporate retreats, celebrations. There's a particular perversity to celebrating life events in mansions built with money from death. Imagine getting married at an estate that was purchased with profits from hooking teenagers on cigarettes. Imagine a corporate team-building retreat at a mansion built by a man who lied to Congress about nicotine addiction. The venues don't advertise this history. It would be bad for business, but it's there in the foundations and the walls and the very land. Other estates have been subdivided and sold off. The huge properties that single tobacco executives once owned have been broken up into smaller luxury homes. The wealth has been distributed, the estates fragmented, but the original sin remains. And some estates are still owned by tobacco families, passed down to children and grandchildren who inherited wealth they did nothing to earn, built on suffering they weren't responsible for, but continue to benefit from. They're trapped in a moral dilemma not of their making. Do you keep the inheritance, accepting that it comes from death? Or do you give it away, trying to distance yourself from how it was made? Most keep it. Moral clarity is expensive, and inherited wealth is comfortable. If this story made you pause or rethink something, help it reach someone else who should hear it too. A like, a subscription, or a thoughtful comment helps this video travel further and keeps these stories alive. The tobacco litigation of the 1990s revealed something important. Corporations will knowingly kill people if it's profitable and they think they can get away with it. Philip Morris and other tobacco companies had all the evidence they needed to know their products were deadly. They chose to keep selling them because cigarettes were enormously profitable. This wasn't ignorance or accident. It was calculation. They did the math and determined that the profits from selling cigarettes outweighed the costs of litigation and settlement. They accepted that people would die, that they would eventually face lawsuits, that there would be public outrage, and they decided it was worth it. The Virginia estates are physical proof of this calculation. The mansions, the land, the luxury, all of it came from a deliberate decision to prioritize profit over human life. These estates are the reward for corporate mass murder. And the executives who made those decisions faced no criminal charges. The worst consequence they faced was criticism and civil settlements that barely dented their fortunes. They weren't arrested. They weren't imprisoned. They weren't stripped of their wealth. They retired to their estates and lived out their lives in comfort. This sends a message. If you're wealthy enough and powerful enough, you can kill people for profit and face no real consequences. Your estate will remain beautiful, your fortune intact, your family provided for. You might have to endure some criticism, pay some settlements, but you'll die comfortable and your heirs will inherit your blood money. Today, if you drive through Virginia horse country, you'll pass some of these estates. They're behind walls and gates, mostly invisible from the road. You might catch glimpses of stately homes, manicured grounds, the kind of property that represents the American dream of success and prosperity. But behind those walls is a darker story. These estates were built with money from one of the greatest public health catastrophes in history. They represent the profits extracted from millions of addicted customers, many of whom died gasping for breath. They're monuments to corporate deception, to the power of wealth to insulate from consequences, to how beautiful things can be built on the ugliest foundations. The estates are fading from public memory. The tobacco industry's crimes are becoming historical footnotes. New generations of executives are trying to rebrand and move forward. The mansions are just expensive real estate now, their origins forgotten except by historians and public health advocates. But forgetting is dangerous. These estates need to be remembered for what they are, evidence of what happens when corporations prioritize profit over human life, when regulation is captured by industry, when wealth provides immunity from consequences. The Marlboro Man was a lie. Smoking doesn't make you rugged and masculine. It makes you sick and dead. The tobacco industry's claims about not knowing cigarettes were dangerous were lies. The assertions that nicotine wasn't addictive were lies. Every major claim the industry made for 70 years was a lie. And the Virginia estates of tobacco executives are monuments to those lies, beautiful on the outside, built on death on the inside, standing as proof that in America, you can knowingly kill millions of people and die wealthy and comfortable. There's a statue that should exist, but doesn't. A monument to the victims of tobacco, placed outside every tobacco estate in Virginia. It would show a person dying of lung cancer, gasping for breath, surrounded by the cigarette packs that killed them. Below would be a plaque reading, "This estate was built with money from selling the product that killed me." It won't happen, of course. Wealthy people don't build monuments to their victims on their own property. The estates will continue to exist, beautiful and unmarked, while the millions who died from tobacco are commemorated nowhere, forgotten except as statistics in public health reports. The Marlboro fortune built palaces, but it built them on graves. The Philip Morris legacy is written in the Virginia landscape, in beautiful estates and in graveyards, in luxury and in suffering, in the gap between how tobacco money looks and what it actually cost. Every cigarette sold was a small theft of breath, of years of life. Multiply that by billions of cigarettes, millions of smokers, decades of addiction, and you get the tobacco industry's true product. Not tobacco or nicotine, but death on an industrial scale. The estates stand as monuments to that industry, beautiful and terrible, testimony to how much blood money can buy and how little justice money can avoid. The dark story of the Marlboro fortune and the Virginia estates isn't just about tobacco. It's about how capitalism works when unconstrained by ethics or effective regulation. It's about how corporations can knowingly harm people if the profits are high enough and the consequences distant enough. It's about how wealth provides insulation from accountability, how beautiful things can be built on ugly foundations, how history gets rewritten by the winners. Philip Morris executives knew their products killed people. They sold them anyway. They made billions, built estates, lived in luxury, and died unpunished. Their companies faced civil settlements, but no criminal charges. Their wealth remained intact. Their estates stand as beautiful reminders that in America, you can commit mass murder if you do it through a corporation and have enough lawyers. This is the legacy written in Virginia horse country, in estates behind stone walls, in mansions built with cigarette money. It's a legacy of lies, addiction, disease, and death. And it's a legacy that remains largely unacknowledged, unmarked, forgotten by everyone except those who died and those who remember them. The Marlboro Man rode off into the sunset in American advertising. In reality, he rode into an oncology ward, where he died of lung cancer like so many of the people who believe the image he sold. And the executives who created that image, who knew it was a lie, who sold death disguised as freedom, they rode to their Virginia estates, where they lived in luxury built on the graves of their customers. That's the dark story. That's the truth behind the beautiful facades. That's what the Marlboro fortune actually bought. Mansions for executives, graves for smokers, and proof that in America, wealth can purchase immunity from almost anything, even mass murder.